Good morning, everyone. It's 9 o'clock. Not 8 o'clock, it's 9 o'clock. If you're here this morning, and you are here, that means you've had 1 hour less sleep last night. So if you feel like nodding off while I'm talking, I won't be offended. In fact, I might even join you. Would you open your Bibles to Daniel 8 and hold on to the spot? We'll be coming to that in a little bit. God works in all human history, and I've been trying to emphasize that as we go along. God is trying to tell the Jews that they can't live without him, that they need to follow his law, that his prophecies are always accomplished, and that better times are coming. And I think those are the messages he might be giving us as Christians today. We're still in the Greek period, although we left the Alexander and that sort of thing period, and we went into the generals that followed him, especially a couple of them, a Ptolemy and a Seleucid, whose names were Ptolemy first, Seleucus the first, who were very power-seeking men. They argued a whole lot, fought a whole lot over that area between the two of them right there in Judea, Palestine. And by doing so, they created a lot of pain for the Jews in that area. We talked about the fact that Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, inspired, at least permitted, the development of a new great library in Alexandria, which then brought about the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, which, according to one author, made the Hebrew scriptures available and intelligible for people of other tongues and other races, and it was a major accomplishment for the Word of God. We talked about how important this translation was for the New Testament, in that it was translated, that is, it was quoted. The Old Testament was quoted 283 times, and of those quotations, 283, 90 of them came directly out of the Greek translation. Talked about the development of the Sanhedrin, and this kind of a situation was probably where Jesus found himself when he was being examined by the Sanhedrin the night before he was crucified. We talked about these different Ptolemies who reigned over Judea, who controlled Judea, but was also back and forth between them and the Seleucids quite a bit. But they were the ones who were actually reigning over Judea for about 100 years. And then finally, in 200-ish, Ptolemy V Epiphanes was defeated by Antiochus III. Antiochus III took Palestine back, or Palestine, and then he tried to develop his own kingdom. He still controlled Palestine, but he wanted to go north, got himself beaten by the Romans, and decided he might not want to go in that direction. And that brought about the rise of this man, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was called the madman, even though he called himself the illustrious. The Jews called him the madman, Epimanes. We talked about the fact that Antiochus actually chose high priests for Jerusalem. He gave the high priesthood to this guy Menelaus on your right, because he gave him more money. And that'll be important a little bit later. Jason and Menelaus were both Hellenizers. They both were wanting to lead the Jewish culture and biblical text and blend into the Greek culture. That didn't work out for either one of them. We talked about the fact that Antiochus IV then was confronted by the Romans, who were competing with him for Egypt. But they were all a lot more powerful than he was, and so they essentially said to him, we're going to take Egypt. If you want to go in there and try to take it yourself, you're going to be fighting us as well. And so Antiochus IV gave up and left his ambitions to control Egypt. And then we get to Daniel 11. It says, he shall be afraid and withdraw and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress and shall take away the regular burnt offering. Now, let's look at Daniel 8. Verse 11. It became great, that is, the little horn of verse 9, which turns out to be Antiochus IV. That little horn became great. Verse 11, even as great as the prince of the host, that would be the high priest, most likely. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, that's the prince of the host, the high priest. And the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Overthrown. So we come back to Daniel 11 on your screen, which says, then they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. And that's where we were last week when we stopped. So we've got this expression, the abomination that makes desolate, or the abomination of desolation, as the New Testament calls it, and we'll get to the New Testament in a minute. I'd like to read you a few lines from a Jewish rabbi. He was a Lithuanian rabbi, died in 1953. Looking at this word abomination, and the expression abomination of desolation, which apparently was a kind of a strange expression even in Hebrew. He says this term, abomination, appears more than 100 times in the Old Testament. An abomination is normally a great sin commonly worthy of death. Scholars generally agree that the reference of these prophecies is the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who ruled Palestine from 175 to 163 BC. Antiochus treated Israel with such violence and contempt that they rebelled against him. We're going to talk about that. His forces entered the temple, stopped the regular sacrifices, set up an idol for Zeus, and apparently offered swine there as a sacrifice. This is an abomination because it is idolatry. And so apparently this word abomination is always tied to idolatry. And it brings desolation because it defiles the holy place at the heart of Israel. This act was an abomination of desolation, or an abomination causing desolation. And that, by the way, is what the NIV says, an abomination causing desolation. He goes on to say, two more lines, the context of these passages leaves no room for doubt as to what was intended by this somewhat odd expression, namely the transformation by Antiochus Epiphanes of the sacred temple of Jerusalem into a heathen temple. Into a heathen temple. All right, so let's go to the New Testament where this expression is used by Jesus himself. At the beginning of Matthew 24 and of Mark 13, he has said this temple that you're looking at here, and people are talking to him, is going to be destroyed. Absolutely, completely, totally destroyed. They ask him a few questions about how that's going to happen. And he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, parentheses, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, that parentheses was likely added by Mark and or Matthew. They both have the parentheses, so I don't know which one added it first. But it was the writer saying, okay, now you're reading this prophecy by Jesus. Think about the prophecy of Daniel and what happened already once in the temple because of the prophecy of Daniel. That sort of thing is going to happen again, Jesus is saying. And that sort of thing happened again in AD 70 when the Romans invaded Jerusalem and profaned the temple, defiled the temple, and destroyed the temple. So it was a kind of a double prophecy with a double accomplishment. But that's as far as it goes for what we're going to say about the New Testament, because that's a New Testament matter for the person who's teaching Matthew, I guess. All right, so what did Antiochus do when he set up the abomination that makes desolate? And why? Why did he do that? Well, he was already discouraged. He was already tired. He was a man who, as I said, was looking for power, always more territory. But the Romans were rising, and they were confronting him. And he saw they were stronger than he. And he didn't like that a bit, but he had no choice before he stepped out of that circle to say, okay, I will do what you say and I will go home. So he was frustrated, he was angry, he was actually furious. On top of which, remember Menelaus, that high priest that he'd put in place. Menelaus had been run out of town by the Jews in Jerusalem at about the same time because they didn't like his Hellenizing practices. And then there had been a rumor in Jerusalem that Antiochus IV was dead. So the people in Jerusalem took all of his officials up to the walls of Jerusalem and threw them off. And when he got news of that at about the same time that the Romans had said, go home, that was the end for him. He was going to go into Jerusalem and he was going to vent his anger on these people. He was going to plunder Jerusalem. He was going to defile that temple, and he was going to make them know who's the boss. And that's essentially what he did. In the temple, on the altar of burnt offering, he erected a statue to Zeus, which, according to some authors, actually resembled him. And I wouldn't doubt that, but it's not confirmed. All right, so here are the laws that he put in place. Now, brethren, we have to try to see if we can feel the effect of this kind of imposition upon the people of God who wanted to follow his laws. No burnt offerings, no sacrifices, no libations in the sanctuary, no observance of Sabbath or feast days, no circumcision, no priests, no holy place, no sacred altar, no prayers in the sanctuary. Idol worship was mandatory on pagan altars with pagan practices imposed. Sacrificing of impure animals, including pigs, was mandatory. Eating of the meat of sacrificed pigs was mandatory. Mandatory monthly sacrifices to honor Antiochus, mandatory attendance for those monthly meetings. All scrolls of the law were to be torn up and burned. All persons found in possession of a scroll of the covenant to be put to death. All persons observing the old law to be put to death. All persons not observing these new laws to be put to death. Now, if that's not strong enough, I'm going to try to put some of that in a Christian perspective. And I'm going to be a little bit graphic. So let me just try to put that in perspective. Suppose, as we as Christians, suppose some kind of a power took over our country and this city and this building and said to us, you will not have any worship services. You will not sing in the sanctuary, in the building. You will not have any kind of Sunday meetings or any other day meetings. You will not have any baptisms. You will not have any preachers, elders, deacons. You will not have any Lord's Supper, no prayers in this building. You're going to have an idol worship mandatory on pagan altars with, say, drag queen practices imposed in this building. You're going to have to, go to a weekly meeting in this building with homosexual practices up on this stage. You have to watch, mandatory. Or a weekly kind of a thing that you have to, same sort of practices, you have to participate in. And if you don't want to do it, you die. Mandatory monthly sacrifices to honor who? Satan. All scrolls, all Bibles are going to be torn up and burned. How many Bibles do we have? Anybody who has a Bible, put to death. Anybody who observes the principles of the Bible, put to death. Anybody who does not observe these things, put to death. How would we react to that? When you read this list of stuff that the Jews had to go through, it's impossible, I think, for us to really understand how awful this was. It was terrible. And if the same thing happened to us, my question is, what would we do? What would we do? Thousands were slain. Cambridge Companion to the Bible. Thousands, some say 80,000 people died within a short time after he imposed these laws. Greek soldiers and their paramours performed licentious heathen rites in the very temple courts. Swine were sacrificed on the altar. That's Pfeiffer. Pfeiffer adds that an old scribe whose name was Eleazar was flogged to death because he refused to eat swine's flesh. Mothers who had circumcised their newborn sons were driven through the city and cast headlong from the walls. Pfeiffer adds that their families and those who had circumcised the children were also executed. So a lot of Jews gave in. They gave in, saved their lives, and turned themselves into Antiochus' system. Many others fled the city, went wherever they could get out in time. Whatever happened to them is not really known. What did the Samaritans do? Because this wasn't just in Jerusalem. It was in all over Judea and Palestine. The Samaritans, well, here's what they did. They decided they would give Antiochus IV the title, King Antiochus, the god, Epiphanes. And they renamed their temple, the Temple of Jupiter, Hellenius. That didn't go well with the Jews in Jerusalem, and it was one of the last nails in the coffin of the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans. Now, I want to tell you this story that's in 2 Maccabees 7. I don't know if it's inspired. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's true. But it's told by Josephus, and it's told by the Maccabees, and it's supported by all the authors who examined this area as at least possible, if not true. The story, I read it last night, and it's so graphic, it's so terrible. And in the presence of Antiochus, a mother and her 7 sons are brought forward. And he tells them, you must renounce your God, your law, and I want you to eat this swine's flesh. The oldest son stands up and says, we can't do that. And so Antiochus has that boy's tongue cut out, has him scalped, has his feet and his hands cut off, puts him in a burning pan and roasts him in the presence of his mother and his other brothers. And then one at a time, he does the same to every one of those brothers. And in each case then, to each brother, he says, now you don't have to do this. I'll make you a rich man. And each one of those brothers, according to the story, exhorts Antiochus by saying, you shouldn't be doing this. There's a God in heaven. You're going to be standing before him. And they all say that. And he just gets madder and madder, more and more angry. And each one is mutilated and roasted. And then before the last one is executed, actually before that, Antiochus encourages the mother to tell her sons, you should not defend this faith at the price of your life. Give in, why don't you? I'm your mother, I'm telling you. She refused to do that. She told each one to die heroically, to die bravely, to count on God's presence and his rewards. And so every one of the sons was killed, and then finally the mother as well, all in the same way. Okay, so true story or not, all the authors who write about this say that it is at least the kind of thing that Antiochus was doing, and very easy to believe. Okay. Antiochus' aggressive Hellenizing activities provoked a full-scale armed rebellion among the Jews. And that's our next subject. And before we go on to that, does anybody have a question or a remark before we go into the next? Oh, okay, one hand is up.
Leviticus 13 talks about leprosy.
Leprosy.
About lepers and various
Yes.
other unclean things. So that establishes quarantine. And we take a look at what they faced. And for 2 years, the government said we couldn't meet in this building. And what do? We were under threat of death. If anybody had COVID, then by all means, stay home. But what's the difference when the government simply comes along and says, here, you guys can't meet for 2 years? Locally, I know groups that did. The original group that we started with not only met, but they also invited the Seattle police to come and have lunch in their parking lot.
Okay.
Absolutely.
We hear you, Marshall.
In Seattle.
Okay.
So, we look at that and what those people endured. Whew, I'm not game for that. I
don't think any of us
No, I want anything to do with
would
that.
be game for that. Yeah, thank you, Marshall. Okay. We're entering the Maccabean Hasmonean period, or the Maccabean Hasmonean, if you prefer. I don't know what the best way is to pronounce that. It sort of depends. I have on the screen, I should have maybe taken it off, that I was going to look at the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and the Herodians, and the Apocrypha in this section. I'm going to hold on to the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Herodians because we're coming up to the end. I'm not sure we're going to have the time, and I do want to talk about the Apocrypha. So that's going to be a change in the order. But now this period is technically still a period in the Ptolemaic Seleucid period, which is still a period in the Greek period. So we're still in the Greeks, specifically, all the way to 64 when the Romans take over. Now this rebellion was as significant to the Jews, probably as the American Revolution was against the British power. But the outcome is completely different, obviously, because no matter what the Jews went through, and no matter some of the successes that they had, they didn't end up with their own nation in the same way that America did. So here we see God working to preserve Jewish identity. We also see during this period that the Jews are still trying to govern themselves, mostly without the help of God. But we see that really, really doesn't work. This period is a period right before the coming of Jesus, and there are a couple of maps that show some of the developments during the battles that took place and that expanded the territory of the Judea, of the Maccabeans. The Maccabean period then will see Israel securing relative religious freedom for a time under Judah Maccabee. It'll see the priestly aristocracy relatively defeated, or at least diminished, under Jonathan Maccabee. And it will see relative political freedom under Simon Maccabee. Then there will be the beginnings of a dynasty coming out of the Maccabees called the Asmonean or the Hasmonean dynasty. And all of that will be lost, absolutely lost, when the Romans come in. So, Antiochus IV wanted to destroy the Jewish religion and their culture. But the brutal nature of his persecution proved that the Jews were made of sterner stuff. He underestimated the Jews who wanted to stay with the law. There were enough of them there that resisted him, and it turned into a full-scale rebellion. Here's the mindset of the people at the time. Quote from Robert L. Cate, if that's important. He says the Jewish people, the ordinary folk who made up the backbone and heart and sinew of the nation, were appalled at the abhorrent policies of Antiochus Epiphanes. With the leadership and encouragement of the Hasidim, who were the ones who stayed the closest to the law, the ancestors of the Pharisees, the people decided to resist. There was no decision from the top. The people who had never been involved in politics before made this decision. By ones and twos, then by tens and twenties. They decided that faith was more important than life. The people believed Antiochus IV would carry out his dreaded policy, being that to destroy Judaism. They feared the king, and rightly so, but they feared God more. Interesting statement. They feared God more. This Maccabean period will last about 100 years, from 167 to 64 BC. And here's what happened that got it all started. Now, Antiochus had altars set up all over Palestine, in every village of any consequence. And the rebellion began in a little village west of Jerusalem, about 20 miles, called Modin, in which there was an altar. There was an emissary from Antiochus. On a certain day, then the emissary came and he stood before this altar that he'd had constructed, and he told the Jews to come forward and sacrifice on this altar. First of all, there was no reaction. Everybody just stood there. So he said to this priest, this old priest whose name was Mattathias, you should be an example for the rest of the people. Come forward and offer the sacrifice. He refused. And when he refused, another Jew in the crowd said, okay, I don't want to offend Antiochus too much, I'm not going to get anybody killed here. So he came forward to make the sacrifice himself, which enraged the old priest, who then took out his knife and killed the man who was trying to sacrifice on the altar. He then killed the emissary from Antiochus. Then he had some people come up and they destroyed the altar. And then this man Mattathias with his 5 sons all went to the hills and organized a small army because they knew they had done the undoable as far as Antiochus was concerned. They were all condemned to death. They weren't going to fight any kind of an open war. It was going to be a guerrilla war. It had to be a guerrilla war against such a large enemy. They organized a force of about 3,000 men to begin with. Then it grew to 6,000, and apparently it never got more than 12,000. Now, Antiochus had tens of thousands in his armies, tens of thousands. They began this guerrilla warfare, and what they did was they would raid villages, mostly at night, and they would kill all the Antiochus's men that they could. Then they would disappear into the hills. They even killed groups of Jews who were following Antiochus's rules. Now, Antiochus had an army of about 50,000 men at this time, and there were 3 major battles, and he lost all of them against this small group of guys coming down out of the hills and then disappearing into the hills. Antiochus himself was not present at this point. He was off in Parthia or somewhere like that, because there was a rebellion over there as well. It was his generals who were leading the fight, but he was losing his generals. His major generals, his top men, were dying in these battles against Mattathias and his sons. Now, the son that took over the military side of this resistance was Judah. And he was called Maccabee. The name Maccabee comes from the word Mattathias the word from Maccabeus in the Greek, which means hammer. It was the style that they used. They came in and they hammered, and then they disappeared. And so they were called the Maccabees, beginning with Judah, who was the main military guy. And apparently he was really, really good at guerrilla warfare. He knew the countryside well. He received fresh support every time he won a victory. Sometimes it is said Antiochus's men would go out at night on patrol, and they would not come back. That's how efficient this small guerrilla warfare team was working. So Antiochus had underestimated the power of this new movement. And as I was saying, he was losing generals. Apollonius and Siren, his major generals, were killed. And then the 3 others they gave up when they saw how determined these men were. So, in 164, 3 years after the temple had been defiled, Antiochus took his forces out of Jerusalem. And then Judah, Maccabee, moved in with his armies, retook the city, and purified the temple and rededicated the temple. Okay, now let's go back to Daniel. Chapter 8 still. Verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." And verse 26 of the same chapter says, "The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true." So I think what we have here, there are some people that don't believe this, and there are arguments on both sides, but I think what we have here is an exact accomplishment of this prophecy of Daniel's that indicated 3 years later, after the defilement of the temple, it will be reconstructed, rededicated. The date of the desecration was 167. On the 25th of Kislev, or December, 3rd anniversary, date to the very day, the forces of Judah, Maccabee, entered and rededicated the temple. Here's what Pfeiffer says about that. They entered the temple, and removed all the signs of paganism installed there. The altar dedicated to Jupiter, or Zeus, was taken down, and a new altar was erected to the God of Israel. The statue of Zeus Antiochus was ground to dust. Now, I'm going to tell you another story, and this one is Jewish tradition, but I think it might be, if not true, at least have some value in it. Let's say it that way. They went into the temple, and they wanted to light the menorah, the candelabra, that was supposed to be lighted and lit all the time. And it wasn't there. It had disappeared. So they made a temporary one. Then they went looking for the oil. They couldn't use just any oil in this menorah. It had to be a specially prepared olive oil, pure, in a flask with the seal of the high priest. There weren't any that they could find, but yeah, they found one. They found one. It would burn for 1 day. That's all the oil that was in it. It would burn for about a day. And it would take 8 more days to prepare any more oil. They lit it anyway. And they're calling this a miracle of Hanukkah because that oil, they say, burned for 8 days. At least that was the Jewish tradition. And that is the tradition that is at the basis of the celebration of Hanukkah, which is called in the New Testament the Feast of Dedication, which Jesus celebrated with the rest of the Jews, or at least he was present in Jerusalem. According to John chapter 10, Jesus was walking in the temple at the time of the Feast of Dedication, and the Jews gathered around him and said to him, so forth. And now, Jesus walking in the temple doesn't mean he was celebrating the Feast of the Dedication, but he was at least present in the temple at the time that feast was being held, and so whatever that means, I think it's an interesting thing to notice. All right, back to the Maccabees. And this guy, Antiochus IV, told you he had been over at Parthia. Put myself back together here. On his way back, he died. Nobody seems to know how. Nobody knows where his body is buried. Here's what Daniel 11:45 seems to say about him. Now, if he's talking about Antiochus at this point, I'm not sure. But if he's talking about Antiochus, here's what he says. He shall come to his end with none to help him. That's a really sad thing to have to say about anybody, actually. Even an enemy, he shall come to his end with none to help him. He came to his end, but the hostilities between Seleucids and the Jews, especially in Jerusalem, continued for quite a while after this. There were a lot of, I've got written several words here, endless battles, chaotic period, factions, executions, political intrigues followed this period. All right, so I'm going to go through these, let's see how much time we have. I'm going to go through these rebels, I guess we would call them. I always have trouble remembering this word. Maccabees. That word always slips out of my head when I want to think about it all by itself. Okay, so anyway, we're going to talk about all of these relatively quickly. I've got Judah listed second, although he's chronologically a little farther down. These are Judah because he was the head of the military arm, essentially. And the others were mostly soldiers. Mattathias the father. Those first 4 dates are the dates of their death, and then the others are the dates of their reigns, because with Jonathan and Simon, they pretty much reigned almost as kings, but we'll talk about that when we get to that. So Mattathias dies. He's the one who got this all started in 166. Judah dies in 160 in an open field battle, not the kind of thing he was good at, on top of which he only had, he only had 800 men, and the Seleucids had 20,000. So he was killed. John, his brother, also killed in 162. Eleazar was also killed in battle, but Eleazar was killed in a very strange way. I don't know if you can see this very well, but the Seleucids used elephants, and Eleazar decided that the best way to take an elephant down was to get up underneath him, which he did. Can you see this? He's right here. He got up under the elephant, plunged his spear into the elephant's underside, and what happened to the elephant? He collapsed right on Eleazar. That's how he died. And I'm thinking that during this time, a lot of armies used elephants. That probably happened a lot. Elephants falling over and killing soldiers. Anyway, Jonathan became the leader. Jonathan Maccabee. He preferred diplomacy to war, but he wasn't too bad at fighting when he had to, and he did some fighting. And he beat a Seleucid general, whose name was Bacchides, and he negotiated a kind of peace with the Seleucids, which included these good points: amnesty for all Maccabean rebels, freedom to return home, freedom of religion and religious practices for the Jewish people, freedom for all Jewish prisoners of war. So at one point, Jonathan was the high priest in Jerusalem. He was the governor of Judea, and he was even considered a member of the Syrian or the Seleucid nobility. He was good at making treaties and making his wishes heard. But a lot of people in the community of the not the Jerusalem, but the Seleucid community still didn't like him, and they arranged to have him taken as a hostage when he went to some sort of a banquet. He was taken as a hostage and held for ransom, demanding the Jews to give up certain cities, including Jerusalem. The Jews refused, and so Jonathan was executed. In spite of this agreement, he was executed. So it didn't make a lot of sense, I guess. It wasn't, at least it wasn't respected by the Seleucid authorities. And then Simon became the next ruler. He was the oldest and last surviving member of the Maccabees brothers. But he turned out to be a pretty good ruler, pretty good leader. But during his time as ruler, there was a lot of tension. There were a lot of problems. Simon represents, I guess officially, the transition between the Maccabean rebellion and the Hasmonean dynasty. Remember Hasmonia, I don't know if I told you or not, when Mattathias had descended from a guy called Asmoneus, and that's where that Hasmonean business comes from. So anyway, I was asking myself, when did the Maccabees become Hasmoneans, or how did this transition occur? And it occurred when a religious movement became a dynasty, and it occurred when a military action became a political action. When the Jews became political, when they went from a kingdom to a dynasty, that was the end of their rebellion, and it was essentially the end of any possibility of them having what they really needed as a people. So in 140, the Jewish people, 37. In 140, the Jewish people formally, this is Ferguson saying this, formally proclaimed Simon commander of the army, ethnarch of the nation, and high priest. Now, here is the, that's from 1 Maccabees. This text is from 1 Maccabees. I want us to notice some things, what the people were saying about Simon. They were saying he will be the leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arrive, because this is a period when there are no prophets, and they're still looking for a prophet to come. Then look at these words. Take charge of the sanctuary. Appoint officials over the country and the weapons and the strongholds. Take charge, and he should be obeyed by all. And then they go on to say, he is the only one that should, he is the only one that should be clothed in purple and wear gold. That's cover language for a king. Only a king can wear purple and wear gold in this time. None of the priests shall be permitted to nullify any of these decisions, or to oppose what he says, or to convene an assembly in the country without his permission, or to be clothed in purple, and there it is again, and put on a gold buckle. Whoever acts contrary to these decisions or rejects any of them shall be liable to punishment. That's a king there. He has become the king. He's not using the word. The Jews are not using the word, but he has become a king. Real soon they're going to start using that word king. But he's the ultimate authority. So here's what has happened. Israel is no longer a people of God. Israel is no longer ruled by the law of God. We've got a question over here. Go ahead, Adam.
Aren't they leaving the door open by saying until a prophet arises to actually potentially anoint a king?
Say again, aren't they leaving the door open to
A door open. Well, in that statement, they say until a prophet arises.
Yeah. Well, I guess they sort of are.
They're leaving the door open that potentially a prophet could come anoint. They're not labeling him as king.
No.
But they're saying, hey, we're going to do this until a prophet arises, and which would be the mode of transport for God to actually anoint a king through a prophet.
I guess you could say that, yeah. I guess this probably means, I hadn't thought about this, but the Jews are probably still looking for that prophet who's not coming. He's still not coming. So until he comes, we're going to do this. Something like that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is my microphone on? Suddenly doesn't sound like it. I heard that. Let's see where we are. Israel is no longer a people of God. Israel is no longer ruled by the law of God. Simon's position has become a secular, hereditary position. It was leading that way for a long time, okay? This is sort of the confirmation of it. The high priest's office had become political as well as spiritual. Also, that was leading up to it for a long time and has now been confirmed, because all these guys that were ruling as Maccabees were also high priests. Okay, they're the high priest. Simon, not God, is the absolute leader of Judah. He's the king, in essence. All contracts are controlled by him. All his decisions are considered infallible, and no disobedience is permitted. Pretty radical for a Jewish man who's not living under the kingship, like the king period of the kings, David, Solomon. They had this kind of rule, but that had gone away after the captivities, and now these Jews are trying to come back to that a little bit. All right, so there were some achievements of the Maccabean revolt. The end of the Seleucid oppression, I would say the relative end of the Seleucid oppression. The relative political independence and relative religious freedom. The Seleucids were still there. They were still powerful. They could take over Jerusalem at any time. But they were trying to respect some of the freedom of the Jews. All right, so here's a remark by Roper, and we'll quit with that. This success, however, had come at a high price. The blood of thousands shed over a period of many years. An even more significant cost was the sacrifice of certain religious principles. I would say many religious principles, in order to achieve power, a tendency which became more evident the longer the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, ruled over Judah. There's a thread running through all these stories that strikes me, and that is men with power always want more, even when they're supposedly people of God. We have to avoid that. Men with influence don't need to seek more influence, need to humble themselves before God and say to God, you're my ruler. I'm not going to be the ruler over anybody. Inspire me, help me teach, help me preach, help me put out the word. But I'm not the one they're supposed to look at. They're supposed to look at you. These guys forgot all of that. They became kings. They became the rulers. They became the high priests even when they weren't descended from Levi. It's crazy how that works, and I guess it's human nature. All right, we're going to stop there. I have 43 on the back clock. 2 minutes is not really enough to do anything else, so I'm going to turn you loose for a couple of minutes after we hear Marshall's comment. Marshall will turn you loose after he's finished.
I really appreciate what you're doing. And if people pay attention to what's going on here, Daniel is filling us in on the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32. So the people will be ready, supposedly, allegedly, when the Messiah comes.
Right.
But of course, that's the Messiah that came is not the one they were expecting.
That's right.
Still, all this stuff, thank you. This is really important to know. Israel is a total disaster.
Absolutely.
At this time. Thank you for telling us that.
Thank you, Marshall. All right, see you all later.